We went down on this jigger from Mamaku down to Terakinga, cutting through a lot of the growth on the track, but we did get through it all. When we first got clearance to move our jiggers through Terakinga, a group of us slowly pushed forward in two jiggers up the track, cutting, just enough to get us all the way up to Mamaku, and we did that in a day. It was about 5 of us. We were keen to cut through all this gorse with just hand tools and so forth, just enough to get the two jiggers right up to Mamaku, and when we finally got into Mamaku, it was quite incredible. It's a very interesting line. It's unique because it's one of the steepest inclines in the country. You wouldn't notice it until you do the section between Mamaku and Terakinga, where it's a 135. It's hidden. There's very little connection to any road, and the section between Mamaku and Ngatea is inaccessible by road.
Rotorua has been a magnet to humans since they first arrived in New Zealand some 800 years ago. Its boiling mud pools, hot springs and geysers all create a sense of awe and wonder in everyone that encounters them. Once European settlers arrived, it quickly became a favoured tourist destination, and people all over the world came to experience its wonders. It's not surprising that early in this period, as the new town of Rotorua grew, a decision was made to build a railway into the area. A company was established to achieve this, and construction began in 1881 from Morrinsville via Putararu and the Mamaku Plateau.
It was opened to bring tourists in from Auckland to Rotorua for the pink and white terraces at Mount Tarawera, because in the process of building the track, Mount Tarawera erupted and that put a bit of a stop to it all, and they continued building the track and bringing tourists down, and then they started using the line more for freight as well. So there was a lot of timber and so forth and a lot of freight going up and down the line. It was planned, which was probably around 1930s, to extend it through to Taupo, and there was some building and cutting done just south of Rotorua. The Depression stopped all that, and a lot of that never went ahead.
As Rotorua is situated inside a volcanic crater, getting there from any direction involves traversing steep hilly terrain. This made the final section of the railway into Rotorua one of the steepest in the country. Climbing up to an altitude of 575 metres on the Mamaku Plateau was on a gradient of 1:35, and it was the same on the other side down to Rotorua. This necessitated using the largest locomotives that were available, and at the end of the steam era in the 1960s, the big J and K classes did all the work. For most of the line between Ngongotaha and Putararu, there are few adjacent roads, so only certain sections where access was possible could be photographed or filmed. This was an interesting section, as large portions of native forest alongside the rail corridor were left intact, making the railway journey to Rotorua a very picturesque one.
In the days prior to me getting involved, there were occasionally certain trains going up to Namakua right through to Putararu.
One such journey was an excursion by the Railway Enthusiast Society from Auckland to Rotorua behind two vintage DA-class diesel-electric locomotives. This was held in the late 1990s and was one of a number that were run in the last few years before the line was eventually closed. The train is just reaching the top of the grade at Mamaku and approaching the former railway yard, which is adjacent to the present sawmill.
Mamaku was a very old historic railway village and quite a big sawmilling area. All the Mamaku area was widespread with bush railways, and the mill at Mamaku is still the last remaining mill at Mamaku. It was a railway mill and processed a lot of timber to build all the railway houses around the region. They used to bring logs in from out around about the area. There were a lot of different timber companies up there, privately owned.
The first sawmills at Mamaku were built from the early 1900s, when the railway eventually reached the area. And as there was a plentiful supply of native rimu trees, many mills were established. The only way of transporting the logs to the mills was by way of bush tramways, as this was in an era well before trucks were a viable alternative. From the early days, a number of steam locomotives that were surplus to New Zealand government railways were utilised along with some specially built bush locos. At one time, there was a number of sawmills with a vast network of logging tramways stretching into the bush in every direction. Principal among these was a sawmill acquired by the Stores branch of the New Zealand Government Railways in 1916. They had a great need for timber to construct workers' houses throughout the country, and timber from their Mamaku mill went a long way towards satisfying this need. As a consequence of all this activity, the railway yards at Mamaku became a busy hub from where the sawn timber was railed to all parts of the country. As time progressed and the old steam locomotives wore out, an ingenious local engineer was contracted to design and construct a number of special-purpose motorised railway tractors. His name was Ollie Smith, and his tractors and railcars became synonymous with the bush tramways around the Mamaku Plateau. These were based around truck motors and components, and successfully took up the task of hauling the logs out of the bush. Many of these survived to the end of the bush tramway era and are now preserved, with at least one having been restored to an operational status. Mamaku had one of the last operational logging tramways in New Zealand, and this facet was not lost on a number of rail enthusiasts. They raced from all parts of the country to capture the dying moments of what had been a part of a massive countrywide undertaking. Ian Tibbles of Greymouth was one of these, and his 8mm colour film footage shot in the late 1960s provides a lasting testament to the uniqueness of this operation. Running with their surplus railway carriage bogies to the site where the felled logs were loaded was easy going. However, the return trip could provide the drivers with a very different set of conditions. This was also in the days before the widespread use of bulldozers, and to haul the logs to the loading site, a network of winch-operated log haulers were employed. These locomotives were designed so that all their wheels would provide traction, and the rear ones would have the added weight of logs on a return journey to improve the adhesion on the sometimes greasy rails. The sole surviving sawmill in Mamaku was the final destination for these heavy native logs, and although still in existence, it now only mills exotic timbers.
The track was in excellent condition. It was nothing wrong with it. It was just overgrown in patches with gorse and blackberry. There was quite a few long patches with no growth at all on them. Looked like it was still a real railway. In one area, which was where the lookout was over the lake, it was all overgrown in blackberry. It wasn't as bad as gorse and broom and stuff. We still had to cut it all back.
My father did 40 years in the railway. My uncle did 40 years in the railway. Dad did his 40 years and finished up in charge of points and crossings division. And I started working in Woburn as apprentice in July 1943. I wanted to get a trade, and once I'd got the trade, I could take off, go anywhere, do what I wanted, as long as I got that piece of paper in my drawer. And at the Batoni Tech that I went to, they recommended that the Woburn workshops was the best place for apprentices to learn their trade. It's very broad training. It was terrific, and it's a shame they don't have it today, because you finished up having 3 months in every department, from tinsmith, brass shop, boiler shop, everywhere else. We did it, you know, down to making our sea wagons that I can recall making way back in those days, even to overhauling the steam generators for the locos. We had 3 months on that as well. So it gave us a very broad cover of different things that would strike under our trade.
This is a carriage from Glenbrook in Auckland.
I finished up with a contract with the railways to unpack their wagons of furniture, and finished up with a lady. It was her that introduced me to what was called the Second Chance Train Trust, and she took me along to one of their meetings. It just evolved from there, and I was asked if I'd go on their committee, and I did. And I was travelling from Lower Hutt up here for about 7 years before I shifted up permanently. They did passenger trips to Mamaku and through to Putararu and Rotorua for the afternoon, and have an evening meal in the pub there, and have artists there, and come back here midnight or so on a Saturday night. Their first year they ran very well, but unfortunately the second year they ran into a lot of debt, and it appears from the information, because I wasn't involved at that time, that the more experienced railway people tried to tell the then chairman of Second Chance what he should be doing or not doing, But he apparently went his own way and finished up owing a hell of a lot of money to both on-track and mainline steam.
An approach from a trust called the Second Chance Trust. They wanted to run steam over the Christmas period when the New Zealand tourists were in Rotorua. And it's a very, very pretty line. It's a lovely line. So we took the KA up there, and I think we ran for 2 weeks. The first year was very successful. I think we left at 10 in the morning. Took about 2 hours to get up to Mamaku, or an hour, might have been an hour to get to Mamaku. People were up there for about an hour, had a look around Mamaku, because there's not a lot to do in Mamaku. Back on the train probably midday, and back, I think we're sort of back into Rotorua around about 1 o'clock, or it may, I'm not quite sure of the timing, but it may have been all done in the morning. But whatever it was, it meant people, I think it was the morning, it meant people could go on the train in the morning and then they had the afternoon free to themselves. Now that worked quite well, and the train was popular and it was successful over the 2 week period. The next year the Second Chance Trust decided to run it again, and that time the director of the trust had decided that Mamaku had a lot more to offer. He felt people would be happy to be up there for something like 2 or 3 hours. So we'd run up in the morning, about an hour up, and people were meant to go on bushwalks and different things, but in reality they literally, a lot of them just hung around till the train was ready to depart, back down to Rotorua. And that year was not successful at all, and I think it was the change of timing. It really meant that the trip occupied people for a full day, or family for a full day, and so literally the wheels fell off. Trains were being run up there empty, and that was a shame, because I think if they'd have stuck to the original formula, they could have done quite well over that Christmas period. Probably a 5 or 6 day period, but New Zealand's a small country and limited population, so it is a limited market. I think you've got to tailor whatever you do to the size of the market and be a bit realistic with your expectations. We actually got the J running first, and we did quite often trips from Auckland to Rotorua. We used to get down there and give people about 2 hours in Rotorua and then head back to Auckland. So it was an Auckland, Rotorua, Auckland trip. KA came on the scene later on. It cost a lot of money to move a steam engine or were based at that time in Wellington. It cost, and Auckland, and it cost a lot of money to move equipment from either Auckland or Wellington to Rotorua. So you've got to be guaranteed a certain amount of patronage or a certain sum of money, which we were by the Second Chance Trust, before you can actually commit yourself to doing it. As I mentioned, that second season was really a disaster. They just ran out of money, that's what it came down to. They didn't get the income. Well, unfortunately, like a lot of these things where debt's involved, it did end up in a court case, and we were ordered to be paid by the courts. We got a certain sum of money, we didn't get all our money. The trust resurrected itself in another form, and we started dealing with new people who were very good to us. We got most of our money back, which I'm pleased to say. Now, a chap called Jim Ross was involved, very ethical man, and he was very determined to make sure the new group started off on a good footing. Lessons have been learned. I mean, to be fair to the first lot of people, they got it right the first time, and then probably got too enthusiastic and tried to build on that success and altered the formula, and then it turned out going all bad. At the moment we're running about every 6 weeks or 8 weeks out of Auckland, trips to various places. So the more destinations you've got, of course, the more attractive it is to your customers, that's the public. So every time a line closes, that's one less destination you've got to offer, which tends to be quite restrictive. So yes, I'd welcome the line to be open. If it was open from Putararu right through to Rotorua, most definitely we'd be running trips out of Auckland down there. Whether it would be viable in private hands is a moot point. If you own a bit of railway line, there's an awful lot of maintenance involved. If you've got 50 kilometres of track, you've got 50 kilometres of weed spraying and 100 kilometres of fencing to look after. So, let alone painting the bridges and all that sort of thing.
The number 1 bridge on the Putararu line, which is about 1 kilometre out of Putararu and goes over a big creek, still in pretty good condition considering it's there on its own. But the track from there right through to Ngatea is all gone, except for 2 kilometres of it. There's at least 10,000 sleepers missing out of the whole track from Mamaku right through to Putararu. It'll cost a lot of money. The last train to run on the track was the Farewell Express, which came down from Auckland to Rotorua. I happened to hear about it and thought, right, good opportunity to take that journey up to Mamaku and back again.
The final trains to use the Rotorua line were the Geyserland Express rail cars, and owing to a falling patronage, they were eventually cancelled in October 2001. The Railway Enthusiast Society in Auckland decided to conduct one last excursion on the line before it was permanently closed, and they did this on the 23rd of February in 2002. The track had become rusty and overgrown with weeds, but this did not prevent the last train from running the full distance over the line from Putararu to where the line had become terminated at Kotu, on the outskirts of Rotorua. Before the train returned to Auckland, local residents were able to take a short ride up to Mamaku and back. This was to be the last train to run on the Rotorua line.
In the early days of growing up near Palmerston North and going into Palmerston North because my grandfather had a shoe repair shop right across from the railway station. And every time I went there to visit, I'd always be going over to the railway station and looking at the trains. Right through the middle of the square, and the clock tower's still there today. And that's where I got it all, where I fell in love with it all. I went to Waihi and explored the Goldfields line, and I met one of the operators there, and he invited me onto the train, and then he invited me into the cab, to the driving cab, and we talked from there and went for quite a few trips. Then I went back to Rotorua, and I got involved with the Ngongotaha Railway section, and we ended up by just rebuilding the Ngongotaha yard, cleaning it all up, laying new line, and we built a lot of new track basically with nothing, a lot of second-hand stuff. Yeah, and then in the end the trust was looking for someone to come up with an idea to save the whole branch, which they we're looking at taking over, because they already had the lease on the section from the highway right up to Kotu, which we were running jiggers on and all that at the time. They were trying to do a plan to run into Kotu and back. They couldn't run up to Mamaku, and they couldn't run over the highway. One thing, the track wasn't cleared and it needed a lot of upgrade. And the other thing was that any locomotive or rail vehicle using the grade would have to have a certified driver, and finding those was pretty rare. It's when I initially got my cousin Neil Oppett involved, and I rang him up because he'd in the early years been big in whitewater rafting and so forth in the area. And I left it all to him, and he came up with a lot of ideas. He'd searched the world on YouTube with different rail ideas, and then he put it all together. And with the trust, he went down to Wellington, to the railways down there, and talked them into giving us a lease on the line they managed to get it for, I think, 25 years. I had to venture down into the other end, where I then went into Ngatea and discovered the track there. Then I walked back down to about Pinedale and then back again. And that was my first experience of seeing that part of the track, which was around about 7 kilometres of line. It was totally overgrown, and the rails were all on the side of the track. Some of them had been unbolted, some of them were still bolted together, but all the sleepers had gone. The bridges were still there, but the sleepers were taken off them. And then I walked back and filmed the whole thing, and it was probably about a year later, and I went back down there, and that was before we started clearing the track around the Turakinga area, and Kiwi Rail had a helicopter do a full spray of the track, and that went right through. And then when I went back down to Ngatea and walked the track again, I found it was all dead. It was totally different, and it was much easier to access it, but it was to the point where I couldn't do much more about it. Between Mamaku and Galaxy Road, I've done all of that many times. Galaxy Road is just 6 kilometres the other side of Mamaku, on the Putararu side, and from there all the track is still intact except for about 4 sections between Mamaku and Galaxy Road. And Galaxy Road, that's where a forestry road crossing is, and there was about 23 track sets missing there of sleepers. To gain the rest of it, there was the part at Turakinga. I'd gone onto the track on the highway there and discovered that there was a lot of sleepers missing, and it's totally overgrown with gorse and blackberry. So then we started clearing the track. It was already cleared up to Turakinga. And then I started rebuilding the line and bringing all these rails back into place, and I just basically rebuilt the whole thing. And then we had a lot of spare rails down in the Ngongotaha yard, so I utilised a lot of them to the right gauge and cut pieces up to fit and joined them all together and laid out sleepers around 8 to the track set and high railed the lot and joined it all up. And over about 2 months I had it all connected. The first process was the relaying. That was when Neil got involved. Then we moved ahead and we got all that other machinery in, and we unbolted all the rails and we pulled all the sleepers out, and then we got the digger in with the mower on it, and we mowed the whole of the track right through. We had all the rails systematically set out. We got the digger in, and it was a dig out, lay and relay. So the digger would go in and we would be digging out enough to put 4 sleepers in at a time, and then we'd drop them in, backfill, then another 4 and so forth all the way up. And we did an average of about one to 2 track sets a day. It was just the 3 of us laying the tracks. There was a guy in the digger, and we had the truck with all the sleepers on. When I got Neil involved in it, he came up with this plan to build a rail cart, and he got a guy in Auckland who built a lot of small gauge locomotives and so forth, and he came up with this concept of building a rail cart, and that's where the rail cruiser came into force. And we thought we were going to get it all together in 5 minutes, but we didn't really know the ramifications of all the legalities and rules and so forth and compliances. So it took quite a bit of time, and then we had to build a station and so forth at Mamaku. The track's operational from Mamaku down to Turakinga. It's fully licensed to run the rail cruises on. We have got the condition to run right through to Lake Road at Kotu in Rotorua, but because there is 5 road crossings and 1 major road crossing, major highway crossing, we needed to come up with ideas of how we were going to do it. In the end, we got ahead with all that. Kiwi Rail, they still own it. Railcruising.com have got the lease on it for the next 30 odd years. Kiwi Rail basically did that so they could at least hold the track, because it's one of the only lines in the country that Kiwi Rail don't actually own the land, and it's the iwi that own the land. And the condition was that it was to be used for rail purposes. If it was ever to be closed, they wanted the land back.